If your primary goal is to lose weight, you should not do cardio. Fast twitch muscle fibers and slow twitch muscle fibers, L-carnitine, which is one of the worst supplements, mTOR pathway, AMPK pathway. Why does that happen? Because there's a demand for it. Hey guys, my name is Chouksey. I'm founder of Fitter, and I'm back with yet another episode. First of all, I would like to apologize. I could not upload a video last time because I was traveling and unfortunately didn't get time to record the video. But I'm back, so let's start this one. Today we are going to discuss about cellular physiology. We are going to talk about everything that we have learned in our previous videos and take it a step further and start applying those things to training. Before we move forward, let's do a quick refresher. So we know that each and every system in our body is basically made up of cells. We have trillions of cells. Cells make tissues, tissues make organs, right? And because we have different kinds of tissues, different kinds of organs, it makes sense that we also have different kinds of cells, because your brain does something completely different. Your heart does something different. Your intestines do something different. Your skin has a different function. Your red blood cells or white blood cells have a different function. Your sperm cells have different function. So similarly, it makes sense that your muscle cells need to have a form that serves a specific function, right? In case of muscle cells, we are basically talking about contractile forces. It is these contractile forces that allow humans to move, right? And so if you look at the diagram, you'd see that muscle cells are typically elongated. They are long cells. And if I were to do a cross section of the cells, they'd look something like this. And we are talking about this muscle cell. So on top, what you're looking at is you're looking at a muscle fiber, which is also a muscle cell. Inside the muscle cell, you have something what we refer to as myofibrillar. And so you have a lot of these myofibrils, again, which we'll discuss a little bit further. So you have these thousands of myofibrils packed inside one muscle fiber. And these myofibrils are basically surrounded by or encapsulated in the cystoplasm or sarcoplasm. In case of muscle cell, remember we had cytoplasm in the original cell, but in case of muscle cell, we refer to that as a sarcoplasm. Okay, so they are suspended in a cytoplasm. And each of these myofibril is basically like a series of sarcomeres, which are kind of put together, okay? And if you have a look at the sarcomere, you'd realize that in these sarcomeres, they're basically like a series of fiber filaments, and then they have the ends, and then they are connected together. So it's like small, like strings, which are connected together to make one single myofibril. So muscle cells have myofibrils. Myofibrils are basically made up of repeating units of sarcomeres. And these sarcomeres basically have different kinds of proteins. So you have actin and myosin, which are the primary contractile proteins, and this is basically what we are talking about when we say, hey, we are building up muscles, right? So two types of hypertrophy, sarcoplasmic and myofibrillar. So when we talk about myofibrillar hypertrophy, we are basically referring to these proteins, myosin and actin, right? And these proteins, basically, they are embedded in a system where they overlap kind of each other, right? So in a relaxed state, it would look something like this. So you have this actin protein, and this is like a myosin protein. And I'll explain in a while what happens in a contractile position. So whenever there's a contractile or the power stroke is happening, these myosin proteins, they start moving closer to your actin protein. And this basically creates the contractile motion. So this is a contractile state and this is a relaxed state. Okay, so this is what happens. And I'll also explain you how this happens, but just look at the diagram and I'll just repeat it once again. So you have a muscle fiber, which is an individual muscle cell, and each cell contains millions of myofibrils, and each of these myofibrils basically have repeat units of sarcomere, and sarcomeres are basically nothing but actin and myosin fibers, which are kind of organized in an overlapping position. And when these myosin and actin filaments, then when they move over each other, it produces contractile forces. Okay, so let's now get into the details of how these contractile forces work a little bit more. But before that, understand that each and every muscle cell is connected via your neurons, and that basically forms a neuromuscular junction, right? So you have the nervous system, which penetrates throughout your body, connected with your spine and your brain, right? And it extends to each and every single body part, right? So if I'm moving my hand, my brain is first giving a signal, and that signal is passing through the neurons, through the nerves, to my hand, right? And basically what's happening is this is going to be an exchange of some ATP. Nerve impulses will travel down my hand and will allow me to move my hand with the help of contractile forces. So as you can see in the diagram, how your neurons, each and every neuron is basically connected to my muscle fibers, using a neuromuscular junction. So every time my nerve cells are connected to my muscle cells, that place is called a neuromuscular junction. Okay, so now let's talk about this complex looking diagram. I'll make it simple for you. So remember, in the last video lecture, we talked something about the sodium-potassium pump, and we talked about how our entire body works with the help of sodium-potassium ion exchange. This pump is the fundamental mechanism through which our body moves forward. Our muscles produce contractile forces, right? So taking that further, basically what happens is you have sodium concentration outside cell. Sodium is an extracellular ion, right? Typically, sodium likes to stay outside the cell. And you have intracellular ion like potassium, right? So what happens is whenever there is a nerve impulse, now if the sodium ions have to enter the cell, and they can't enter the cell just like that, they need an active transport, right? So there's going to be some amount of ATP, which is going to convert into ADP. With the help of this active transport, sodium ions get inside the cell and potassium ions go outside the cell. What this does is creates an electrochemical potential, a negative electrochemical potential. And because of this negative potential of roughly around 70 millivolt or something, very small amount, but negative, right? So this negative potential is then detected in your ER, or in case of muscle cells, we call it as a sarcoplasmic reticulum, right? This electrochemical potential is detected, and this ER, which is kind of a host for calcium ions, it releases calcium. This calcium basically binds to a protein called troponin, which is connected to the head of myosin filament, and then starts pulling myosin backward, okay? So basically what happens is you have a look at the diagram. So you have the myosin filament, and then you have the actin filament. And so you can see those myosin heads, right? So basically calcium binds to the troponin protein on the myosin head, and it starts pulling it forward. And when it pulls it forwards, you can see that there's a contractile force which is produced. So you have muscles which contract and then they relax. Of course, you can see that all of this happens primarily with the help of sodium-potassium ion exchange. And sodium-potassium, both are active transports, require ATP to move in and out of the cells. And this requires energy, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So moving on, we have different kinds of exercises, and we have just seen how cells basically function, specifically muscle cells, how they function. Now let's talk about a little bit about mitochondria. As we have seen in previous lectures, that mitochondria is powerhouse of the cell. And let's go back to the cross section of the muscle cell again. So you'd see, instead of having a single mitochondria, muscle cells typically have a lot of mitochondria. And we look at the sarcoplasm, which is the intracellular fluid matrix. So that fluid matrix basically contains all the organelles. So your myofibril, your mitochondria, all of that is basically inside the sarcoplasm. And it also have proteins like myoglobin. It also facilitates the transport of oxygen. And then it also helps channel nutrients, because at the end of the day, if it's a muscle fiber, it's going to require some energy. So it also stores glucose or glycogen. It also stores IMTG droplets, right? Both of which are actually fuels. So now coming back to when we typically refer to as hypertrophy, when we say, hey, your muscles are getting bigger, and hypertrophy means basically getting bigger. Atrophy means getting smaller. So hypertrophy means muscles getting bigger. So whenever we refer to muscle hypertrophy, we typically say, hey, your muscles are getting bigger. Now, when we say this thing, hey, muscles are getting bigger, we primarily refer to two different kinds of hypertrophy. One is referred to as sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, and the other one is referred to as myofibrillar hypertrophy. So in this case, myofibrillar hypertrophy, now it should be obvious that the number of myofibrils within the muscle cells increase, which practically means that the actin and myosin fibers are also getting thicker, and simultaneously you also have myofibrils, which means the number of myofibrils within individual muscle cells are increasing, right? So, and why does that happen? Because there's a demand for it. If you want to, let's say, lift heavier weight, and your body feels that, hey, my muscle cells do not have enough amount of myofibril, or they're not generating enough forces, there's a need for the body to increase the number of myofibrils, at the same time increase the thickness of both myosin and actin filaments. So this entire thing is referred to as myofibrillar hypertrophy, in which the myofibrils are getting stronger and the number of myofibrils are increasing. The other thing is referred to as sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Now, like I said, the cytoplasm or sarcoplasm in case of muscle is also the storage site for fuel, because at the end of the day, these muscle cells are going to require some energy. And we know that energy, or ATP, is primarily generated with the help of, either your glucose or your IMTGs. You typically don't consider amino acids as a great source of energy. So in this case, you can store both glucose as well as IMTGs. Now, if a lot of energy is required, it makes sense for these muscles to locally store large amounts of glycogen. So when the glycogen stores inside the muscles, or the sarcoplasm, the size of the sarcoplasm gets bigger to accumulate more glycogen, it's basically referred to as sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. And obviously, sarcoplasm is not just glycogen, it's also a lot of water, right? So size of glycogen increases. Similarly, the amount of water stored in the muscles also increases. So whenever the size of your sarcoplasm is increasing, it could be water, it could be increased number of myoglobin, it could be increased number of water, it would be referred to as sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, right? So sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, increase in the size of sarcoplasm. Myofibrillar hypertrophy, increase in the size of myofibrils and the number of myofibrils, as well as the thickness in myosin and actin muscle fibers. And when we talk about protein, this is exactly why you need protein. So you have primary contractile proteins like actin and myosin, which are made from amino acids, a repeat chain of amino acids. They bundle together, form proteins, and then these proteins bundle together to form actin and myosin filament. Then you have also other proteins like myoglobin, then you have troponin, you have different kinds of proteins. So this is exactly why you need amino acids. And if you don't get sufficient amino acids, you will not be able to build these proteins, or these proteins will not get stronger. Okay. All right. So now when we talk about mitochondria, that before that, let's do a basic revision. I mean, we discussed how cellular metabolism works, right? So we have seen how energy is generated. And typically when you want to generate ATP, the first process is like glucose will undergo glycolysis, generating some ATP, and then it will convert into acetyl-CoA, which will undergo Krebs cycle, which will generate some more ATPs and NADH. From there, it will undergo ETC, which is an electron transport chain, and perpetually continue to make more ATPs, right? So inside the muscle cells also, muscle cells can either use glucose and they can use fatty acids. Typically at rest, when there's sufficient amount of oxygen available when you're breathing, muscle cells would prefer using fatty acids for fuel, right? But at the time when the oxygen is less and glycolysis can happen even in the absence of oxygen in the cytoplasm, outside mitochondria, remember? So that's when the body prefers using glucose, right? So have a look at the diagram. You have glycolysis, which is happening in the cytoplasm outside the mitochondria, and then from there glucose converts to pyruvate, which converts to acetyl-CoA, which converts further into different kinds of substrate that undergo oxidative phosphorylation inside the ETC and generate ATP perpetual amount, right? Similarly, fatty acids are there. Fatty acids typically undergo some bit of oxidation outside the mitochondria, primary oxidation, and then they shuttle into mitochondria in the form of acyl-carnitine. From there, undergo multiple cycles inside the mitochondria, and finally converts into acetyl-CoA, which undergoes finally ATP, and again more ATP, right? So this is what mitochondria does in case of exercise. Now, depending on what fuel type is getting used in your muscles, you'd either have less mitochondria or you'd have more mitochondria. Because think about it, if somebody is doing lots of endurance training, which means that they are getting sufficient amount of oxygen, right? If they are getting sufficient amount of oxygen, the body has no trouble generating enough fuel with the help of mitochondria. They have no trouble in burning fatty acids, right? And this basically also leads to increased amount of localized fatty acid storage in the sarcoplasm, right? More IMTG accumulation. So you have more IMTG accumulation, more fatty acid uptake in the muscles, and therefore more mitochondria. In a similar manner, if somebody is engaged in high intensity training or weight training, where they're not getting sufficient amount of oxygen, likely they would not require more amount of mitochondria, because most of the activity they're performing is primarily happening via glycolysis outside cytoplasm. So it would make more sense for them to accumulate more glycogen, which can be converted into ATP using glycolysis, right? So different exercise intensity also affects different kinds of fuels being used by the muscle cells, and thereby the conformation of these muscle cells also changes. But before we go ahead and look into the different kinds of adaptation, let's also do a quick revision of energy system. So in your body, you typically have three different kinds of energy system. One is your ATP PCR or phosphocreatine system, in which basically you have some amount of muscle ADP, right? Adenosine diphosphate. And basically what happens is you have also some stores of muscle creatine phosphate. And what happens is that this muscle creatine phosphate lend some phosphate to ADP to form ATP. And then this ATP can further be hydrolyzed. And this is a very quick process, but it can only last for, let's say, 10 to 15 seconds. And it's an extremely energy intensive process. So a great example of PCR system would be like a short sprint, which gets over in, let's say, 10 seconds, right? And after 10 seconds of sprint, 100-meter sprint, you are like exhausted and you have to stop and you have to breathe, right? So extremely high intensities are typically fueled by PCR systems, and they only last for 10 to 15 seconds. Somebody who keeps on working on these systems, obviously the creatine phosphate stores go up and they can, again, utilize the system for maybe 20 seconds, 30 seconds, right? So athletes typically do that. The second system is anaerobic respiration, in which primarily glycolysis is being used as a way to generate ATP. So now you know that we have glycogen and we have glucose, right? So glucose is typically, glycogen is stored in the cytoplasm or sarcoplasm. And when the body needs energy, the glycogen will convert into glucose, and this glucose is going to undergo glycolysis to produce ATP. Now, depending on the amount of glycogen you have in the body, your body can roughly operate in this system for maybe 1 minute, 2 minutes. So still not a very sustainable source of energy, but you can sustain, I'd say, moderate to high intensity activities for up to maybe even a longer duration, right? But after a certain point of time, and all the ATP is exhausted and you have to take in oxygen, right? Because your body otherwise will start accumulating lactate, which will again make it difficult for your muscles to function, because lactate can also cause a lot of fatigue in your muscles, all for good. Now, after that, you have the more sustainable energy system, which is your aerobic respiration, right? So once you go from, anaerobic system where you're not taking in oxygen to a aerobic system where you are kind of started breathing again, then your body can efficiently burn fatty acids, right? So basically you have instant energy, which is like 10, 20 seconds maybe. Then you have a short-term energy, which maybe lasts for 2 minutes, 3 minutes. And then you have the aerobic oxidation, which can like go on and on and on, right? So first one produces ATP from readily available ATP or ADP sources, uses creatine phosphate to hydrolyze ATP. The second one is anaerobic respiration, primarily glycolysis, which is glucose burning. And the third one is aerobic respiration. You have sufficient oxygen and the process is happening inside the mitochondria. You're burning lots of fatty acids, or IMTG for fuel, right? So now, depending on what kind of training you're doing, it makes sense that the body is going to make certain changes. For example, if you are somebody who's only doing sprints, if you're only doing sprints, which means you're kind of not getting enough amount of oxygen, right? Your ATP PCR system will become more and more efficient, right? Which means that a normal individual would have some amount of creatine phosphate in their muscles, but a sprinter would typically have more amount of creatine phosphate, because the primary energy source here is ATP PCR system, right? And these cells, the cells will be extremely fast twitch, which means that the contractile force which is being produced by cells is going to be extremely quick, okay? And extremely short duration. It's not a slow contractile force, it's a fast contractile force. So these muscle fibers are also going to be slightly more different. Like think about muscle fibers as different kinds of rubber band. One is a rubber band which will go easy, come easy. Then other one is like go easy, a little bit easy, but a little bit difficult. And the third one is like very high twitch muscle fibers, something like quick and quick, right? So that's basically we're talking about muscle fibers. So these kind of guys who are primarily training in a PCR environment or training in, let's say, something called a sprint, and primarily utilizing the ATP PCR system will have very high twitch muscle fibers. And these high twitch muscle fibers have key characteristics, right? These muscle twitch fibers lack the amount of mitochondria. They don't have sufficient amount of mitochondria. And if they don't have sufficient amount of mitochondria, they also don't have sufficient amount of myoglobin, because myoglobin is primarily needed for oxygen. If the body does not need enough amount of oxygen, you don't need enough amount of globin inside the muscle cells. If there's not enough amount of myoglobin, there's not going to be enough amount of blood vessels, because at the end of the day, blood is what supplies oxygen to these cells, right? So lack of myoglobin and lack of mitochondria gives them this key characteristic that these muscle fibers are typically whitish in color. On the contrary, if there's a muscle fiber which constantly requires a lot of oxygen, those muscle fibers would have more mitochondria, because most of the energy synthesis or most of the IMTG or fatty acids are being burned in mitochondria, right? That's where the Krebs cycle and ETC is happening, right? So these kind of muscle fibers will have more mitochondria and more myoglobin, and because of which they also become red in color. So lean meats are a great example of white muscles, and you have red meat, right? So the key difference between these different kinds of meats is primarily the amount of myoglobin and mitochondria. So, and similarly, human beings also, you have different kinds of muscle fibers, and the lack of myoglobin and mitochondria gives them a whitish color, and the presence of myoglobin and mitochondria kind of gives them a characteristic red color. And that's why you have these fast twitch muscle fibers and slow twitch muscle fibers. And fast twitch muscle fibers, which we also call as type 2A and 2B, are also referred to as white muscle fibers. And similarly, you have type 1 muscle fibers, which have lots of mitochondria, lots of myoglobin. They are also referred to as slow twitch muscle fibers. They are also referred to as type 1 muscle fibers, and they are also referred to as type red muscle fibers. And I have talked about this thing many times in my old videos, that form follows function, which means that your muscle fiber type, or the shape of your muscle fibers, the color of your muscle fibers, is going to be determined by the function, right? So have a look at the diagram and you'd see that your slow twitch muscle fibers are typically reddish in color because of presence of more myoglobin and more mitochondria. Similarly, you have type 2A and type 2B, which are slightly whitish, and then the fast twitch muscle fibers type 2B are more whitish because of lack of myoglobin, because the muscle fibers don't need as much amount of oxygen for production of ATP, right? So, and these different kinds of muscle fibers develop over a period of time. So when you are born, you typically have half distribution, or there's like a preset, which could be determined based on your genetics and your family history and whatever. But as you develop, as you grow into adolescence, depending on the kind of sport you play, the muscle fiber distribution starts changing. And somebody who's constantly doing slow training, like just endurance training, like walking, marathons, they will have more slow twitch muscle fibers. And somebody who's doing, let's say, more high intensity training and weight training will have more high twitch or fast twitch muscle fibers. And these muscle fibers, like I said, slow twitch muscle fibers, that they have more mitochondria, so they are going to burn more fatty acids. And it makes sense for these muscle cells to store more IMTG, or intramuscular triglycerides, for fuel, right? So their sarcoplasm is going to have more IMTG accumulation compared to somebody who has predominantly fast twitch muscle fibers. They would primarily store glycogen. It's not 100% this or that, but the distribution percentage kind of changes, okay? So somebody who's into high intensity training, somebody who's into weight training, they will have a sarcoplasm which is bigger, but primarily filled with glucose, glycogen, and water, okay? In that case, those people will also show more rounder, more fuller muscles compared to people who are engaged in endurance training, right? So age-old question, can cardio or too much of cardio hurt your gains? I've just explained you the physiology. It just makes logical sense that yes, they would. Because if you are doing lots of marathons, lots of slow distance cardio, your muscle function changes completely. The physiology changes because your muscle cells are primarily utilizing what? Fatty acids. And it makes sense for them to store more fatty acids, more IMTG, compared to, let's say, somebody who is doing weight training or somebody who's engaged in more power-based training, high intensity training. They would store more glycogen. And on top of that, they will also have thicker actin and myosin filament, because thicker actin and myosin filament would make those muscle fibers more fast twitch. Okay, so they'll have the contractile force which is being produced by actin and myosin is going to be way higher compared to the contractile force which is being produced by a marathoner. Okay, so yes, and in fact there are different kinds of pathways. So how does your body actually determine? There's a pathway through which this happens, and have a look at it. So for example, if somebody is doing resistance training on the left hand side, and you'll have requirements for amino acids because there's going to be some amount of muscle breakdown, right? And there's mechanotransduction, which is basically mechanical tension, right? And basically what it will do is it will activate something what we call as mTOR pathway. So you have the mammalian target of rapamycin, and then there's something called as the AMPK pathway. So understand one thing, when you are burning fatty acids, there's no dearth of fuel in your body. You have a lot of ATP and AMP and even ADP, right? So adenosine monophosphate, diphosphate, and triphosphate. Now, when somebody is doing exercise, obviously the amount of ATP, ADP, AMP, they increase in the cell. But when you're talking about someone who's doing weight training, or you're talking about somebody who's doing high intensity, let's say running or sprint, they would not have sufficient amount of ATP, ADP, or AMP right? So there's two different pathways which get activated. Basically, the absence of ATP and AMP can signal these pathways. For example, if somebody is not generating sufficient amount of ATP, but there's mechanical tension, the body will shift to mTOR pathway. On the other side, if somebody is doing, let's say, slow intensity training or cardio, where a lot of fatty acids are getting burned, you have lots of ATP and AMP, which will trigger the AMPK pathway. So in the mTOR pathway, you then further go into, you have something called as muscle protein synthesis, and you have muscle protein breakdown. And of course, over a period of time, these pathways will work on your muscle cells and will change the way your muscles look and function. So in case of, let's say, weight training or high intensity training, you have the mTOR pathway, which will be activated, and this pathway will basically result in more muscle hypertrophy, where it will work on your myofibrillar hypertrophy as well as your sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, store more glucose as fuel in your muscles. On the other hand, you'll have AMPK pathway, which will act on your muscles and it will result in more mitochondrial density. Now, both the pathways will increase mitochondrial density to some extent, but in case of, let's say, endurance training, you'll have much higher mitochondrial density because it requires the body to burn fatty acids, right? In the case of weight training, the mitochondrial density is not going to be high because it really does not require body to burn fatty acids, primarily burns glucose, right? So mitochondrial density in both the cases is going to be different. In case of endurance training, it's going to be substantially high. Now, people can say, hey, isn't it a good thing that you have higher mitochondrial density? It means that your body is burning more fuel. Yeah. And that's why we have to understand what we refer to as feedback loops in exercise, right? So there are different kinds of functions. There's different kinds of feedbacks, and one of the feedback loop in the body is also called as the depletion feedback loop, which is depletion and supercompensation. So yes, if you increase a lot of mitochondria in the body, yes, your body will burn more fuel, burn more fat, but because of depletion and compensation principle, it is also going to store more fat, store more IMTGs in case you have muscles, right? Instead of storing glycogen, it will store more IMTGs, right? So over a period of time, what happens is that as you have increased number of mitochondria in the body, your ability to burn fat becomes more and more efficient. So here you also start approaching cellular efficiency, and thereby once your cells become more efficient at burning free fatty acids, they also become they also become really good at extracting fuel from less amount of food. Because remember what we are talking about cellular efficiency. Cellular efficiency would mean that, hey, one molecule of fat would yield, let's say, 130 odd ATPs. An inefficient cell would basically be able to extract half of that. So when you have more mitochondria in a cell, obviously you're going to extract more ATP out of cell molecule, right? So over a period of time, what happens is that as you have more mitochondria, your cellular efficiency goes up. And because the cellular efficiency goes up, your requirement for fuel goes down. And as a result, you typically see endurance runners or people who engage in endurance activities, they have a lower BMR or lower resting metabolic rate. They require much less amount of fuel, and it's very easy for such people to gain a lot of weight because first, the propensity for storing fat goes up because of depletion and supercompensation. Body loves storing fat. At the same time, your RMR kind of goes low. Okay, so your RMR slows down. Now, of course, if the person is doing activity every single day and their energy expenditure is extremely high, and for some reason they are eating, let's say, 1500 calories and still running like 2 marathons in a day, they would be able to maintain their shape. But the minute these people start engaging in unhealthy eating habits, or maybe just go a little bit overboard and quit doing marathons and these kind of training, they will have a higher propensity to gain weight, primarily because of depletion and supercompensation. And this is something which I have again and again, form follows function. So there has to be a good healthy mix. Now, if you're somebody who's extremely fat and your primary focus is to lose weight, in this case, if you started doing heaps of cardio, what will happen? Okay, you will have increased mitochondria in the body. Your energy expenditure will go up because you're running every single day. But as your mitochondria increases, as you achieve cellular efficiency, what will happen is your requirement for fuel will go down, and you will start building more slow twitch muscle fibers, which means you will also start accumulating more IMTGs in your muscles and less of glucose. So or you will lose lean mass, you'll accumulate more IMTGs, and at the same time, you will have lower requirement for fuel. So your metabolism will also slow down. And that's why when a lot of people lose weight through cardio, they experience such bad rebounds. Okay, again, nothing against cardio. People think I'm against cardio. It's just that this is it's not that I'm against cardio. I'm just explaining you the trade-off. If you want to be a marathon runner, there's no other way for you to become a marathon runner but by running. A lot of people do endurance activities because they think that endurance activities are helpful for losing weight, which is actually quite the opposite. If your primary goal is to lose weight, you should not do cardio. That's only going to make this journey even more difficult. What you should focus is on a healthy deficit and primarily resistance training. You don't want to increase efficiency at this point of time. Once you have reached your target weight, your cellular efficiency increases, you require less food, good, great for longevity. But for losing weight, that's going to be very, very difficult. Okay. So yeah, and then of course we have let's have a look at once again how exercise affects your endocrine system. Your hypothalamus kind of gets activated, sends signal down pituitary. It releases a lot of ACTH, which will then signal your adrenal glands, which will then release your cortisone, cortisol, adrenaline, epinephrine. All of these hormones are released, and then it will also signal your pituitary gland. And this will also release your growth hormone. It will also, increase the production of testosterone. All of those positive changes happen. And all of these changes then also further affect your mTOR and AMPK pathway, which can further drive the changes in your cells. Okay. Another thing which I want to mention is that, remember, in the last few episodes, we have always talked about how important exercise is. I want to talk about one specific benefit, which is a lot of people don't do exercise because I don't know, they feel like exercise is hard. Of course it is hard, but exercise can be a great modulator for your blood glucose levels. Okay, so we have in the past discussed about insulin mediated GLUT4 translocation, but we also know that exercise can also mediate your glucose uptake in cells. Primarily because if you refer to the discussion where we're talking about how contractile forces are generated, so you have a lot of calcium plus ions which are there in your endoplasmic reticulum, or in this case sarcoplasmic reticulum. When the muscle cells detect negative potential, when sodium potassium are moving across the cell, this negative potential is being detected, and ER basically, or SR in this case, releases calcium ions into the sarcoplasm. Right, that's how the calcium binds to troponin on the head of myosin head. Right, so in this case, because the calcium is present in the cell in sufficient amount, this can also result in GLUT4 translocation. Okay, so GLUT4 transporters are inside the vesicles, and the vesicles will move attached to the surface of the cell, kind of like sequestering, and it will attach to the surface of the cell. It will release GLUT4 transporters, which will trap glucose and then come inside the cell. Okay, so not only do you have insulin mediated GLUT4 translocation and then blood glucose absorption in cells, you also have exercise mediated GLUT4 translocation and therefore effective blood glucose movement in the cell. So exercise can be a great way to prevent any sort of, let's say, insulin resistance. It can also prevent your diabetes. And it can also help individuals who have type 1 diabetes to maintain their blood glucose levels. Okay, so please do exercise. Apart from this, I think this chapter would have helped you. I'm sorry if it got a little complex, but if you watch my previous chapters, you realize that most of the things have been discussed before, except for the cross section of muscles, and how you'd see that everything is kind of connected. The reason why we were discussing all of these concepts in the last chapters is primarily because they are all going to help us improve our knowledge about nutrition and training. And now we know how muscles are, how they grow, how they work, what kind of adaptations happen in muscle in response to different kinds of training. We also know that there are different kinds of pathways which lead to this modification. We know the mTOR pathway, we know the AMPK pathway. Now we know that different kinds of muscle fiber types are there and how this preset distribution gets changed over a period of time in response to the kind of training you do, right? So we covered a lot of these concepts. If you don't understand something, I would request you to watch this video again and again. So that's pretty much it for this chapter. In the next chapter, maybe we'll talk about some more things. Maybe we'll talk about some basic concepts like enzymes, ligands, how things bind to each other, how receptors work, what are these transporters, and let's also talk about how supplements work. So maybe we can use an example of L-carnitine, which is one of the worst supplements, and using that example of L-carnitine, I'll probably discuss about how there are complex metabolic pathways in the body And once you understand the basic biochemistry, you would be able to understand if a supplement is good for you or not. All you would have to do is understand the biochemistry of the supplement, what it's doing in the body, and you would be able to tell, hey, this is bullshit. This is not going to happen. Now, because you understand cell function, you'd be surprised to know that most of these large particles can't penetrate cell membrane, right? We know that oxygen can diffuse through cell easily, or polar ions, or there are active and passive transport through which some particles can pass through, but large particles can't pass through cellular membrane. So a lot of these supplements, which are large particles, for example, collagen. Actually, let's not get into it. Let's cover all of this into the next video. I'll see you guys next week. Thank you.